Okay, so we are picking up in this video with psychoanalytic criticism. Um, if you are familiar with psychology, like if you've taken a Psycho 101 course, then you have already a lot of information and a lot of internal navigation of where this school of criticism is and where it could go. If you have not taken a Psycho 101 course, or if you're not familiar with psychology, you may want to make sure that you are reading the notes and understanding the notes that I've provided for you on psychoanalytic criticism as an entry point, as an introductory level. This is not comprehensive, not by any means. It is really just kind of the start of psychoanalytic criticism, particularly if you're looking at Lois Tyson. She will rely heavily on some of the things that I'm talking about in this video, but she also acknowledges that she is not in the helps section of criticism, and so she herself is also at a disadvantage as well, and encourages her readers to go further than her. So, psychoanalytic criticism, we want to start with two primary schools of thought, Freudian and Jungian, and to get to that point, we need to understand that psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic criticism is trying to build on the idea that you as the reader are having a psychological experience as you are moving through the text, whether that is reading or listening to an audiobook or watching a show or a movie, listening to music. You are having a psychological and sometimes physiological response to the text. And psychoanalytic criticism would say, hey, what's that about? I think with all the schools of criticism, a good way to start them off is if someone were to ask you, hey, what's that about? Like in eco-criticism, there's like all this land. What's that about? In psychoanalysis, there's all these psychological things that are happening. What's that about? So with psychoanalytic criticism, we want to start with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, and Freud lays down a great many theories for psychology, for psychoanalysis, for counseling, for therapy, and a lot of those ideas are still in circulation today in 2025, over 100 years later. However, a lot of things that Freud said and put down as theories of psychoanalysis have historically been kind of set aside. They've been seen as embarrassing, problematic, objectionable. They've been debunked. And so we want to understand that Freud is kind of a good starting point historically in terms of psychoanalysis. We don't necessarily have to buy everything that he is putting down, nor do we need to read it the way that he is trying to read it. For example, one of the theories that Freud puts down is he has the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. And in these two theories, it says that we are ultimately searching for relational and sexual partners who are like our parents. And they're, this is apart from my opinion as someone who is not in the psychological field. That is something that a lot of people would object to almost immediately, that we do not gravitate naturally towards people who remind us of our parents. I will say that there are echoes of things that are familiar to us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are attracted to our parents, either relationally or sexually. Jung will come later and will say that we want to pay more attention to the signs and the symbols and kind of what these archetypes will look like. So Jung would say, anytime that you see an image that is reflective of evil or that gives off evil vibes, there's a reason for that that should be examined. You don't need to know all the details. You just kind of know psychologically that something is evil, and how would you have gotten to the point where you think that that is evil? Well, Jung would say we rely a great deal on archetypes. Sociologically, a lot of what Jung says will appear in sociological literature. But again, what Jung is looking at is these archetypes, these symbols that mean something without us needing to know the details. That across human civilizations, across human cultures, there is something replicable that is interesting and is noteworthy, that we all kind of know evil and we know good without knowing the details. And we know that by the signs and the symbols that are being put in front of us. Now, springboarding off of this, psychoanalytic criticism would go a lot further beyond just Freud and Jung. And we might look at like family dynamic systems. We might look at that as a more contemporary and more familiar expression of psychoanalytic criticism. looking at the Joseph story at the back end of Genesis, I would say that Joseph is clearly, I would say this, using psychoanalytic criticism, I would say that Joseph is clearly someone who has been suffering from family-related trauma and a lot of unhealed, undeveloped trauma within his family system. And when given the choice, he, according to the story, he tries to make peace with his brothers. I would say the psychoanalytic criticism would say he doesn't. Not at all. What he actually does is he entraps his family further. He enslaves his family further. And there is a way in which these patterns will kind of repeat themselves. But the way that we would say that is like, we have already kind of seen this being played out, looking at the 3 patriarchs in the book of Genesis, much earlier than Genesis, looking at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Someone who is looking at family systems would say there's really no solution to this family dysfunction, that they have been dysfunctional since Abraham left his own father. He looked at his father with disrespect. If you are believing the Jewish commentary on the book of Genesis, Abraham is someone who looked at his father, who was an idol maker, and said, I can't live with this anymore. I am going to go worship the one true God. And in pursuit of that one true God, Abraham will sacrifice literally every relationship that he has. He will kind of throw his wife, Sarah, out, not once, but several times. He will almost murder his son, Isaac. He is someone who is really just devastating in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons. And this is not a psychologically healthy individual. So much so that in the next generation, again, using family dynamic systems, in the next generation, Isaac is not at all like Abraham. He will kind of disappear from the story because he does not want to be remarkable. Well, Isaac makes a lot of sense as kind of the after image of Abraham. This is someone who says, there is a God, I believe in that God, but I'm not going to sacrifice my family the way that my father did. And then a generation later, Isaac will have a son. We continue to see conflict between brothers and conflict between the family. And in this next generation, Jacob will, like his father Isaac and like Isaac's father Abraham, will continue this unhealthy dynamic, this really trauma-based dynamic. And he will continue to do the same things. He will kind of have these strange relationship with his wives, plural. He will continue to have these strange relationships of favoritism and competition with his sons. You will see this in Jacob and his 12 sons. You will see this particularly as he identifies Joseph as his favored son. And then when Joseph is kind of thrown away by his brothers, again, you see this kind of this family system repeating itself. So why is all this interesting? Well, the psychoanalytic critic would not stop at Freud and Jung, would not want to say, oh, well, Joseph's coat of many colors, that represents, because we're in Pride Month, that represents the pride flag. Well, not only is that a bad reading, but that's a reading that won't appear for several thousands of years. Like, that is a forced, shoehorned meaning. Instead, a Jungian would look at this and would say, the coat represents so much more than the colors that it has. The coat represents the favoritism that the father has been giving to Joseph all along. And when Joseph wears this coat, it's really just an insult to all of his other brothers. And it is so much more than this beautiful piece of clothing. It is a status symbol. It is an example. It is kind of a physical totem of the ways in which Jacob has favored his son and has disfavored his other sons, has perpetuated this unhealthy dynamic that the other sons, when they name that dysfunction, they are being kind of cast aside by their father Jacob. When they are trying to break this system of toxicity, Jacob says, get away from me. You're unstable as water. You're never going to excel. You're never going to make anything. You're an embarrassment to me. But Joseph is the amazing one because he's young, he's beautiful, he looks like his mother, looking really at the physical qualities rather than the character qualities of Joseph. And again, the psychoanalysis would have a lot to say about the psychology and the impact, not just about Freud and these dynamics of the relationship, and not just about Jung and the signs and the symbols, these totems like Joseph's coat would be, but it also would look at the family trauma that exists, the character, and the ways in which the individuals kind of embody their religious and moral ideals, how they kind of go in all these different directions, and at the same time they can't fully escape the unhealthy environment of their family, generation after generation after generation. So again, by the time that we arrive at Joseph, and he will continue to perpetuate this cycle of violence and trauma against his brothers, even though he says, well, I do this to try and kind of bury the proverbial hatchet and make peace with you, to break this system. What we really see is that he's not breaking the system at all. He's doing the exact same thing, just in new ways, in new expressions of the same trauma-based and unhealthy, toxic family relationships that we've seen all along. So, just as a recap, psychoanalytic criticism does not stop at Freud and Jung, does not look at just the individual and the nature of their relationships, does not stop at the signs and symbols of the things that are appearing inside the story, inside the stage of the theater. It would also, using like family systems and different schools of psychology, would also want to examine the psychological health of the individual characters, the relationships that they have inside of their own family, and how they perpetuate those cycles generation after generation.